Welcome back to Revenue RX, the podcast at the intersection of pharmacy and finance. I'm your host, Lubna Mazen. We've already talked about CMS's proposal to reduce reimbursement for certain 340B acquired drugs to ASP minus 33.4% beginning in calendar year 2027. So today we are not going to rehash the reimbursement proposal. Instead, I want to focus on something buried a little deeper in the proposed rule: the modifiers. CMS is proposing to bring JG back as a payment triggering modifier. TB would remain for certain 340B drugs and providers, and CMS is proposing a new modifier currently called XX to identify drugs that were not acquired through the 340B program. And if this is finalized, it creates a really interesting question. Could a drug purchased outside of 340B actually produce a better margin than a drug purchased through 340B? Margin is reimbursement minus acquisition cost. And when reimbursement changes based on how the drug was acquired, purchasing and revenue cycle become much more connected. One important reminder before we get started is that this is still a proposed rule. CMS is accepting comments through August 31st, 2026, so none of this should be treated as final calendar year 2027 policy yet. Very quick history. From 2018 through September 27th, 2022, Medicare generally paid certain separately payable 340B acquired drugs at ASP minus 22.5% instead of the ASP plus 6%. Hospitals challenged the policy, and the American Hospital Association versus Becerra, the Supreme Court held the HHS could not vary those payment rates by hospital group without first conducting the required acquisition cost survey. So CMS went back and did the survey. Using the Outpatient Drug Acquisition Cost Survey, or ODACS, CMS calculated aggregated acquisition costs for 340B drugs at approximately ASP minus 33.4%. For calendar year 2027, CMS is now proposing to pay 340B acquired drugs at ASP minus 33.4% while continuing to pay non-340B acquired drugs generally at ASP plus 6%. And Medicare needs the claim to tell it which pathway to apply. This is where the modifiers come in. JG, if this proposed rule is finalized, hospitals that are not exempt from the 340B payment adjustment would report JG when the drug was acquired through the 340B program. For separately payable drugs with status indicator K, JG would trigger the proposed ASP minus 33.4% payment. So JG would no longer simply describe the claim. JG would effectively tell Medicare this drug was acquired through 340B, apply the 340B payment methodology. That makes JG the connection between acquisition and reimbursement. 340B does not automatically mean that the JG modifier should be applied. CMS is proposing that certain providers and drugs remain exempt from the payment reduction and should continue to use the TB modifier. That includes rural sole source community hospitals, children's hospitals, PPS, exempt cancer hospitals, pass-through drugs, and qualifying non-opioid pain relief drugs. TB would remain informational and would not trigger the proposed payment reduction. So if finalized, JG means 340B and payment adjustment. TB means 340B, but exempt from the adjustment. Reminder, acquisition status alone would not determine the modifier. Provider type and drug status matter too. Then we have the XX modifier. CMS is proposing a new modifier for drugs that were not acquired through the 340B program. For now, CMS is calling it XX, but XX is a placeholder. If the proposed rule is finalized, CMS says the final modifier would be identified in CY 2027 final rule. The proposed modifier would be required for separately payable drugs purchased outside the 340B program. CMS says the goal is to consistently categorize claims as either 340B or non-340B, improve data completeness, support program integrity, and better monitor acquisition patterns. Think about what changes here. Today, the absence of the 340B modifier can infer the story. Under the proposed rule, CMS wants an affirmative answer. Essentially, JG, TB, or XX, every separately payable drug would have to pick a lane. Why does this matter financially? Now we get to the interesting part. Assume a drug has an ASP of 1,000. Under the proposed JG methodology, ASP minus 33.4% gives us $666. If that drug was acquired outside of 340B, CMS proposes continuing to pay the general ASP plus 6%. That gives us $1,060. The difference between those two payment formulas is $394, or 39.4% of ASP. Now acquisition cost enters the equation. Suppose the 340B acquisition cost is $400, reimbursement is $666, reimbursement minus acquisition gives us $266 in net drug margin. Now suppose the actual non-340B acquisition cost was $900. $1,060 minus $900 gives us $160. In this scenario, 340B wins. The lower acquisition cost more than offsets the lower reimbursement. But now let's change the 340B acquisition cost to $600. Your 340B margin becomes $666 minus $600. That's $66. The non-340B drug margin is still $160. Now the non-340B pathway mathematically produces a larger net margin. Same drug, different acquisition pathways, different modifiers, different reimbursement, different margin. The lowest acquisition cost does not automatically equal the highest net drug margin. And this gives us a simple break-even point concept. The proposed payment formula differs by 39.4% of ASP. So all else equal, the acquisition cost savings from 340B would need to exceed 39.4% of ASP for the 340B pathway to produce a larger margin. The question becomes, is my 340B acquisition cost advantage greater than the reimbursement I give up under JG? And I want to be very clear. This is a financial modeling exercise, not a recommendation to move drugs between purchasing accounts. 340B eligibility, diversion, duplicate discounts, inventory requirements, GPO restrictions where applicable, and other compliance requirements still govern what an organization can do. And the XX does not mean whack. XX means the drug was not acquired through 340B. That could include WAC, but the actual non-340B cost could also reflect GPO pricing, negotiated contracts, chargebacks, rebates, and other concessions. CMS itself found non-340B acquired drug costs around ASP plus 2.7% in the survey, but noted greater variability and uncertainty around rebates and other post-purchase concessions. CMS therefore proposes keeping non-340B reimbursement generally at ASP plus 6 for now. What I would be doing right now, again, this has not been finalized. So I would not redesign purchasing strategies around the proposed rule, but I would start preparing. First, understand where your acquisition status data lives. How does your system know a drug was 340B versus non-340B? Second, audit your current JG and TB logic. JG has not been payment triggering for years. Make sure your old build still makes sense. Third, map the proposed XX workflow. You may not know the final modifier yet, but you already know the decision that CMS is proposing. Build a margin matrix for your highest dollar Medicare drugs. Pull ASP, actual 340B cost, actual non-340B cost, utilization, and site of care. Then model both pathways. Finally, put pharmacy purchasing, 340B, finance, IT, and revenue cycle at the same table. Billing may submit the modifier, but the information driving the modifier starts much further upstream. JG, TB, and XX look like billing modifiers, but if CMS finalizes this proposal, they would represent something much bigger. How was the drug acquired? How Medicare reimburses it? And what margin is left? JG would identify an applicable 340B drug and trigger the proposed payment adjustment. TB would identify 340B acquisition without the payment adjustment. And XX, or whatever modifier replaces it, would affirmatively identify non-340B drugs. For years, the 340B conversation has focused heavily on how cheaply did we buy the drug. If this proposal is finalized, pharmacy leaders may need to ask another question. What happened to reimbursement after we bought it? And right now, hospitals still have the opportunity to weigh in. Comments on CMS 1850P are due August 31st, 2026. Under docket CMS 2026-2344. So understand the proposal, understand your exposure, and if your organization has concerns, make sure CMS hears them before the comment period closes. That's this week's episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a colleague in pharmacy, finance, revenue integrity, reimbursement, or medication access. And remember, healing patients is the mission, protecting the margin is the strategy. This is Revenue RX. Quick disclaimer, this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. The views shared are my own and do not represent any organization I am affiliated with. This is not legal, financial, or reimbursement advice, and you should consult your internal experts before making any decisions.